What is up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today's reaction video is What If World Without the US Part 1. So if it's interesting enough, we'll do a Part 2. I don't know how many parts there is, but yeah, let's find out. Let's enter this journey. Let's get into it. A world without the US, that'd be quite big. You know, the military power gone, the influence gone, friends gone.
Holidays gone.
Oh, well, you can visit other countries for holidays, but US holidays gone. When I said friends, I guess you absolute legends as friends as well, but I meant the TV programme Friends.
Oh, no friends.
Yeah, that hit you more. That's what I meant. I meant the TV programme Friends.
No Young Sheldon.
No Young Sheldon. So many TV programmes, so many influential movies, TV programmes, all gone.
That's really sad.
Would Russia have got to the moon?
No Hannah Montana.
Yeah. Oh, you're right. It's just like, you can't
Wow,
go
that's deep.
Yeah, a lot of stuff which would miss. Maybe other countries would have made their own version of it, but who knows? There's a picture of an astronaut there, so maybe Russia would have made it to the moon first. What would have happened then?
England would have made it.
Maybe Germany would have won World War II. Would we all be speaking German? Do you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean?
That's madness.
That is madness because
Let's
the US has played a massive part. Smash that like button if you enjoy this kind of content. Smash the subscribe button and let's see what it would be like Part 1 by Infographics. Let's go.
When you're popular, everyone loves to hate you. And if you're American,
love to
then
love you.
you should be able to admit that throughout history, the US has done things that deserve being hated for. And if you're not American, then you should be able to admit that throughout history, the US has done things that it deserves being loved for. Yet as the world's sole superpower, the US's influence spreads around the world, in both good and bad ways. What would happen though if the US...
I think same with everyone, you know what I mean? Same with everyone for that, but obviously yours is just a bigger impact because you're so big.
Didn't exist anymore, or at least if its influence across the world stage disappeared overnight. World War II ends in a stalemate. Armchair historians love to point out that the moment Hitler invaded Russia, he was doomed to failure, and thus World War II would have been won by the Allies even without the US. Yet historical truth is not quite that simple. Invading Russia was a critical mistake made by Hitler, and one worsened when the US joined the war and reopened the Western Front in Europe. Yet, what if the US had simply shrugged its shoulders when Russia and Britain begged it to join the war effort? Despite a superior fleet, Britain's war material supply was running dangerously low, even with constant American resupply efforts. Without the US to ship war goods to Britain, the best that the United Kingdom could have done is stave off a German invasion. In war games carried out in the early 2000s by a British think tank, it was discovered that Hitler could never have successfully overcome Britain's fleets, the RAF, or the Home Guard in a cross-channel invasion. Yet this war game was undertaken with constant US resupply efforts underway. Without these resupply efforts, a cross-channel invasion would probably still have been disastrous for Germany, but then again, Germany would have had little need to invade Britain without the US supplying it. A token defensive force could have been left behind in France in order to discourage British invasion, and the full might of the Wehrmacht could have been dispatched to the Eastern Front. Not just reviled as a madman and mass murderer, Stalin was also famously a very poor strategic thinker. He was so surprised by Hitler's invasion that in the years leading up to it, he had taken almost zero precautions against German hostility. To make matters worse, his political purges prior to World War II had decimated the ranks of the Red Army and eliminated most of its experienced commanders. Despite having exponentially greater numbers and firepower advantage in the Winter War of 1939 against Finland, the smaller and much more poorly equipped Finnish army managed to absolutely decimate the Red Army before overwhelming numbers alone forced a defeat. By the time of Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, little had improved
I think
Army.
that is a Russian thing in the past. I don't know too much. And obviously we do our World War history so that, but it's just sheer numbers gotten through, no matter how unskilled we were and stuff like that.
In the way of command and control, logistical support, or even training. When Hitler invaded, his troops quickly seized many of the Soviet Union's agricultural regions, leaving the nation to face mass starvation. If it hadn't been for the US's Lend-Lease aid program to the wartime allies, providing food, raw materials, tanks, planes, ammunition, clothing, and everything in between. The United States provided critical aid to the Soviet Union in its most desperate hour. American raw materials fueled Soviet factories that churned out tanks, and thousands of Studebaker trucks helped move goods around the nation and its troops to the front lines. Warm winter clothing kept Soviet soldiers from freezing to death, and American rations fed both soldiers and civilians alike. As Soviet General Georgy Zhukov said after World War II, "We didn't have explosives explosives, gunpowder. We didn't have anything to charge our rifle cartridges with. The Americans really saved us with their gunpowder and explosives.
Wow.
And how much sheet steel they gave us. How could we have produced our tanks without American steel? But now they make it seem as if we had an abundance of all that. Without American trucks, we wouldn't have had anything to pull our artillery with. Immediately after the invasion of the Soviet Union, the United States gave the nation an interest-free loan of $1 billion, or about $17.5 billion in today's dollars, worth of supplies and raw materials. The United Kingdom was also given an initial lease of between 40 and 50 destroyers. Per the terms of the Lend-Lease, the materials were lent for the duration of the war and expected to be returned or reimbursed only upon war's end if they were kept for civilian use. Any combat losses would not be expected to be repaid. Basically, the US lent the Allies surplus military equipment under the condition that it didn't have to be repaid for unless it was kept after the war was over. In total, the US gave the Soviet Union 44,000 jeeps, 375,883 trucks, 8,071 tractors, 12,700 tanks, 1,541,590 blankets, 331,066 liters of alcohol, 15,417,000 pairs of military boots, 106,893 tons of cotton, 2,670,000 tons of petroleum products and fuel, and 4,478,000 tons of food. It's
just mental. I mean, because obviously in today's world, obviously after the World War, that's when you started getting to the Cold War, where the Soviet Union, USA had the massive issue, the war and stuff like that, and then obviously what's going on in today's world and stuff like that. But you forget that they were fighting on the same side technically back then. And 30 years before the Cold War and all that, the US supplied all that, which is mental to think.
Yeah.
If you think about how it is now and how it has been in the past 50 years or whatever, that is, I mean, I completely forgot, to be honest with you. But when you hear them numbers again, it's like, oh my days, they used to be not friends, I wouldn't say friends, but allies.
Yeah.
Allies, and obviously the USA really, really helped them as well. There's no thoughts on that. That'd be interesting.
clear that without the US, the best the Allies could have hoped for would have been a stalemate, with Germany holding on to the richest parts of the Soviet Union and expelling Britain off the mainland. No European Union. Immediately after the end of the Second World War, Europe found itself in shambles. Nearly all of its financial and industrial networks had been destroyed in the fierce fighting, and entire national economies had collapsed. The war had been the most devastating in human history, and the fate of entire nations hung by a thread. 2.5 years after the end of fighting, there was very little sign of recovery from the European mainland, with millions of homeless and out of work. Then, in 1948, the U.S. Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, drafted up a 4-year plan meant to reinvigorate the European economy. The plan would rely on $15 billion of financial aid, or $250 billion in today's dollars, and it would be completely financed by the American taxpayer. The first target of the Marshall Plan, as it came to be known, would be feeding the European population, as a massive famine was threatening the mainland. Thus, food aid was immediately dispatched to 16 European nations. The Soviet Union and its satellite states had been offered assistance as well, but it had turned it down due to fears of meddling by the US in internal affairs. The main focus of the Marshall Plan was on the recovery of Europe's largest industrial powers, such as West Germany, France, and Great Britain, as it was believed that if these great economies were jump-started, then the effects would spread to other nations. Attempts to rebuild national shipping fleets, road and railway infrastructure, and reconstruct devastated cities were bolstered by American aid money, though the effect of the Marshall Plan is likely less economic and more political, due to the Soviet Union's refusal to partake in
the US, you guys came in clutch. I mean, I didn't know most of that, did you?
No, I didn't.
About all the how much money you guys actually put towards rebuilding Europe and stuff like that. Let us know if you know that in the comments. And again, it's just, how different would it have been if none of that? Because it's all explaining what they did.
Yeah.
Just think, what would have happened if they didn't have it? You know what I mean?
It's crazy.
So that is mental. Like, fair play to you guys. Again, we're best friends. Remember that. And you guys have definitely done some heavy lifting as well.
The reconstruction efforts, the Marshall Plan, and the 16 nations it aided helped establish the political framework for what post-World War II Europe would look like, with the West firmly aligned in solidarity against the Communist East. The Marshall Plan seeded the idea of European unity and fostered an intertwining of European interests, which was President Truman's greatest goals, as only a unified Europe could stand and against the Soviet Union. But also, only a unified Europe could avert another world war. Without the Marshall Plan, European economies would have taken longer to recover than they did, which would have made them more vulnerable to political revolutions fostered by the Soviet Union, whose agents were constantly at work attempting to make the ideology of Soviet revolution abroad or of spreading communist revolutions around the world a reality. The Marshall Plan, however, also laid down the political and economic roots for what would become the European Union. And without it, it's very likely that Europe would have returned to the old power way of thinking that had dominated European politics for centuries. European colonialism prevails. Prior to World War II, European powers retained colonies across the world, and upon entering the Second World War, President Roosevelt made it extremely clear to the Allies that America's help was dependent on the eventual liberation of the majority of these colonial holdings. With their feet to the fire, Britain and France were forced to agree, and after the end of the war, President Truman made it a top priority to ensure that Britain and France, as well as other European powers, held true to their promises to begin liberating their colonies. Though the process was slow, the end of colonialism was much the result of the economic collapse of Europe's great powers, as it was the sheer determination of American presidents to see Europe relinquish its old ways. Without the United States, European colonialism would have continued, and may in fact have worsened. With their economies in shambles, European powers would have leaned even harder on their colonial states, bleeding their economies dry in an effort to rebuild themselves. This would have sparked violent insurgencies around the world, which would have brought with them harsh crackdowns by the colonial powers. In the end, the death of European colonialism would have taken decades more to arrive, and the world today may in fact look a lot more like it did during the age of the great powers. Korea unified under the North, and Japan rises as an imperial power once more. Today, South Korea is a vibrant and prosperous nation, while its neighbor to the north is facing mass starvation and economic desolation. Yet the entire
North
Korea is mental. Let us know if you want us to do a video on North Korea, because I don't know too much about it. I just know it's so private, you can't get anything, and they don't have access to like Facebook, stuff like that. It's all what they control. So let us know if you want us to do a video on that, because I think it would be pretty interesting. Yeah, you guys are just good guys, it seems like. I mean, the US just like, come on, everyone get along. Yeah. We'll give you some money, we'll help start you out. Literally, which you don't see it like that. You know, like...
It's not portrayed as that.
Nah, definitely. And like when we go with the big military and all that, and I guess it's peacemakers with us because we're great allies and stuff like that. But just never heard them stories and stuff like that, which was awesome to hear. And also, I like this video because you're thinking about the title, what would happen without the US, but you're also learning quite a bit.
Yeah, definitely.
Like loads of stuff we haven't heard before.
The entire Korean peninsula would look very different today if it were not for the US. 2 days after the start of the war, the UN published Resolution 83, urging UN members to lend military aid to the South. A UN coalition force was ultimately formed, but it was the US that would do the heavy lifting. The war would end 3 years later after China's involvement, with the US not desiring to see the situation evolve into another major war that would now include China. If the US had not been available to defend the South, the war would have been won by the North far too quickly for the UN to marshal a sizable military response, and the entire peninsula would have been reunited under the North. Communism would have overtaken the South, and while we may be tempted to compare the fate of a communist peninsula with that shared by the North today, it's important to remember that the state of the North's economy is largely the result of US-led sanction efforts against the Kim regime. Without the US to lead these sanctions and under the protection of a growing China, the unified Korean peninsula would be in a stronger economic state than the North is today. If it would have been more prosperous than South Korea is today is debatable. But what isn't is that a communist Korea wouldn't necessarily be as impoverished as the North is today. A communist Korea would have naturally gravitated toward China and become a satellite state. This would have upended Asian politics as we understand them today. Japan, for one, would have been quick to ditch its pacifist ideologies, which were only ever truly possible as a result of Japan enjoying the protection of the United States. Faced with a hostile China, Japanese nationalistic hardliners would have upended the Constitution and rewritten it to allow Japan to once more field a military capable of both offensive and defensive operations. Even today, Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is a member of a right-wing nationalistic party, which in the past advocated a return to imperial power. Japan would have risen as a military power once more, and conflict in Asia would be all but unavoidable. The second half of the 20th century would have been dramatically different without US intervention, and it's likely
Just
that
a bit.
communism would have dominated the global stage both militarily and politically, whereas today we live in a world of mostly strong democratic states. We could in fact have seen a reverse of this, with the world as we know it being made up of a collection of communist states where the democracies are the minority. What would that have meant for global civil rights movements? We can only guess, but in part 2, we'll take a look at how the world may have looked as it entered the 21st century in a world without the US. What do you think would have happened?
Okay, I like it. Part 2. We
Yeah.
don't know if there's any more. Let us know if you want to check out part 2 and potentially the other parts in there. I really enjoyed
It was
that.
really interesting.
Again, it just shows how different our world could have been. I know you could. Some people will say you could take out quite a lot of countries
Yeah.
and things would be different. But I just think for the amount of influence US has had, a lot of these would have significantly
definitely,
changed. You know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah.
Whereas if you took a couple other countries out, even Britain
be a
in some parts of
massive
history,
change.
it wouldn't have been as big. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Smash the like button if you enjoyed it, guys. Smash that subscribe button. Anything else?
Have a fantastic day.
And we'll see you, legends, in the next one. Peace.